Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome from me, David Rose, your moderator, to today's 1-hour debate as a partner event in the EU's Green Week, with its main theme this year, of course, of zero pollution. And our debate today is on safe and sustainable urban mining and how can Europe address its e-waste pollution challenge. Now, let's move on and have a look at how we're going to organise our debate today. Duncan, can we have our next slide, please? Thank you. As you can see here, we've got a wide range of speakers to kick off our debate. It's my great pleasure to welcome 5 important different pillars of the debate here today. We've got Kęstutis Sandoukas from the European Commission. We've got Mrs. Vanessa Forti, Programme Associate at the UN UV Cycle, and also the author of the most recent e-waste monitoring report. We've got Mrs. Monique Lempers, who's the Innovation Director at Fairphone. And for those of you who don't know, Fairphone produces smartphones with a very strong focus on sustainability. We're joined also, I'm very pleased to be joined by Mr. Jim Puckett, joining us at 1 a.m. from the United States, who's the Executive Director and founder of the Basel Action Network. Jim's been working for over 25 years now at the heart of the e-waste debate at a UN and international level. And last but by no means least, also Stephen Art, Project and Supply Manager from Umicore. As many of our audience will know, of course, Umicore being one of Europe's leading e-waste recyclers. So let's move on and have a look at how we're going to structure the debate today. We're going to do it in 5 main phases. First of all, I'm going to start off with a little keynote interview with our European Commission representative to quiz him a little bit about the Zero Pollution Action Plan that we've all seen recently. We'll then move on and bring in the rest of our speakers, get their initial views with some questions from me, and a little bit of debate. Then, importantly, we'll bring in you, our audience, with your questions, which I'll feed to our panel to fuel our debate. And we'll keep that debate rolling towards the end. And then we'll finish off with a final message and call to action or summary statement from each of our speakers. Now, let's move on now and have a look at how you can take part in the debate. I'm working on the principle here that, like me, some of you would use Teams, some of you use Zoom. So just to remind you how you can pose a question during the debate to give to the panel via Zoom. As you can see on the screenshot here, at the bottom, you have that opportunity for Q&A, and you can type your questions directly into the Q&A part. That'll allow you to pose those to me, and I'll do my very best to pose as many of the questions I receive to our speakers during the debate. Now, there's another way I also want you to take part at the beginning. We always think it's a great idea to start a debate, not just with the speakers, but with our audience too. Some of you, you'll know me for this technique. So let's start off with a couple of questions for all of you to show our speakers what your views are. Here's our first question. This is a little bit about the need for recycling in Europe of our e-waste. Do you have any obsolete electronic items in a drawer or cupboard at home that you haven't recycled? Be honest and give us a yes or no. Me personally, I found 7 this morning. Take about 20 or 30 seconds, put your answers in, and then we'll have a look. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Europe's urban mine is not being fully exploited yet, even if we're going to need vastly more resources to meet our Green Deal goals in Europe. So 92% of you there. Right, now let's move on to a second question, the second of 2, just to warm us up this morning and get you involved as our audience. This is a little bit more about ambition and action, because we want to have a solution-focused debate today. So how much do you think Europe has to raise its game with the upcoming revisions in relation to e-waste? A little bit, a lot, or quite a lot? Share your views with us now. Oh, no, interesting results here to see, I think. I'd say the bulk of our audience are going towards the idea that we definitely need in increasing action now. I think we can all accept that with the recent plans we've seen from the European Commission, there's commitment to action. But I think possibly what our audience is also asking for here is to put that into practice, that important implementation, in partnership, of course, not just the institutions in Europe, but also, of course, all the players in the different value chains and all our stakeholder groups. Right, okay, well, with this in mind, that our audience feels we need stronger, more accelerated action at a European level from all our different stakeholders, gives me great pleasure now to bring in Kęstutis from the European Commission. Well, I want to pose a couple of questions, particularly around the Zero Action Plan and our recent activities from Europe. So Kęstutis, thanks for joining us today. And I want to kick off with a first question. Now, look, many of us have read in the Zero Pollution Action Plan that Europe's planning to restrict export of e-waste to third countries. We recognise there's an issue there that needs to be resolved, and you're proposing, obviously, strong action on that. I'm curious, and I think we're all curious to know, what's your plan to achieve this restriction of e-waste export to third countries, and what sort of challenges do you expect to encounter in trying to implement that?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thanks, David, for the question. Indeed, the Zero Pollution Action Plan was where we said most recently what we're planning to do. But those who have been following the topic for a while have seen this message also in the European Green Deal, which is now 18 months old, as well as the Circular Economy Action Plan #2, which we issued last year, just before the lockdown in March, and where we also set the same thing, or nearly the same thing. This concerns the concerns of some of the developing countries, of course, mostly African, as regards the indesired imports of electronic waste, partly from EU member states, remain always valid. The electronic waste contains hazardous components, and its plastics often may contain persistent organic pollutants. And these countries really do not have the means to manage that waste in an environmentally sound manner. And on exporting side, often enforcement and monitoring in member states is insufficient or cannot detect all the outgoing waste movements. So the ongoing revision of the waste shipment regulation, which is one of the big plans for this year, has the aim to improve the enforcement tools concerning the waste shipments. In this Circular Economy Action Plan last year, we outlined a number of targeted actions, prioritizing, among others, indeed, electronics and ICT sector. Then the sustainable product policy announced in the Circular Economy Action Plan also aimed to establish sustainability principles and other appropriate ways to improve the product durability, reusability, upgradability, repairability in the electronic sector. And of course, after that, going into the wider product requirements. Now, with regard to the shipment of the waste batteries, for example, outside the EU, the obligation or equivalent conditions for treatment and recycling should also ensure that the proposed regulatory framework in support of more circular and sustainable battery value chain is not jeopardized. And here again, we need to come back to the broader context of the revision of the waste shipment regulation. Mm-hmm. But of course, this time to look very carefully into this extra EU shipment, what we say outside of the EU, so that we ensure that the EU does not export its waste challenges to third countries. And we're working on a number of the measures. More concretely, the most important one will be a new framework for export of non-hazardous waste to non-OECD countries to complement the existing export ban for the hazardous waste outside of the EU. The export of non-hazardous waste should only be possible to countries notifying that they wish to receive EU waste and demonstrate that they are able to treat them in environmentally sound manner. So that's the new element. This will be accompanied by new traceability measures for extra EU shipments, meaning shipments from EU to other countries, to all third countries. We are thinking of making sure that exporting companies audit the entire supply chain, downstream supply chain, of the chain basically that they are supplying, mm-hmm. to verify that they are only sending waste to facilities which are able to treat them in a sustainable manner. The current rules in the regulation require that waste is managed in conditions that are what we call broadly equivalent to EU conditions in the countries or destination. But the proper implementation of this principle is lacking. And by including concrete criteria in the new regulation, this would be improved and strengthened. And this approach does not mean banning exports of waste, but foresees guarantees that waste exported from EU does not generate harm for the environment and health in the countries of destinations. We will also not forget to address a specific driver for the problems posed by export of waste outside the EU. And this is the difficulty to distinguish between waste and used goods or equipment. And this is particularly problematic for electronic waste, for batteries containing hazardous substances, cars as well. To address this, specific binding criteria will be developed to differentiate between waste and used goods, taking into account the currently existing criteria such as in e-waste. And it will help to ensure that these waste electrical and electronic equipment of waste batteries and e-waste altogether are not exported outside of EU under the disguise of second-hand items, so threatening the destination countries into higher environmental and health consequences. And more broadly, to address illegal shipments occurring both inside the EU and also outside of the EU, we will seek to increase the detection of illegal cases and render the sanctions more deterrent. There are changes foreseen to reinforce investigations and cooperation across the EU against organized crime, and to better fight waste trafficking in the EU and outside the EU. Transnational investigations will be reinforced through involvement of the Commission's anti-fraud office, OLAF, on this issue. So we really believe that with all these changes, we'll have a positive effect to all waste streams, including electronic waste.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very comprehensive overview there of clearly what is a complex solution, and I quote you here a little bit, complex solutions need complex problems need complex solutions. So it's a very holistic set of things you're putting together there. I'm going to quote a former European commissioner that I once interviewed, and he gave me a wonderful quote. He said to me, David, he said, the real challenge with solving issues, I find, is step one, of course, is putting together a good, holistic, robust package of legislative measures. Then it's about getting support from all your stakeholders. Okay, but then the next step, of course, is the devil's in the implementation. Now, in my question, I also asked you about challenges. You've expanded there really clearly for all of us, I think, to help start our debate today about what action you're planning. And it's clearly welcomed, I think, by many. But what challenges do you anticipate in actually trying to successfully implement these ideas?
Mm-hmm. Well, they are multiple. Let's start with the fact that waste is generated in the first place. And why is it generated? Well, at some point, everything becomes waste. The trouble with waste that we're talking about today is that it becomes waste from the products to waste too soon, too early. And part of that is because of the design. And this is what we are trying to fix through Sustainable Product Initiative, as well as through Circular Electronics Initiative, which are planned by the end of the year. I hope they will come out by the end of the year, even though there's some work still to be done. So there we will be looking into the durability, repairability, so that we avoid waste generation in the first place. Why is that important here? Because electronic waste is the fastest growing waste stream among all the waste streams. The numbers are really staggering, and they will be growing even faster. And now that everybody's equipped themselves in the COVID times with electronics at home, and at some point, these devices will also become waste, we can expect quite a lot of issues. So design first, really, that's it. Second is when something turns into waste, then we need to collect it. And collection, of course, is really one of the big things. There, we have collection targets that are in law, in European law, and we've been inching towards the goals, which is the 65% of all the waste that is placed on the market, or 85% of all the waste generated. So far, we've been the latest data that we have, and it's official statistics as well, is that we collect around half. So clearly, there is still a lot to be done, and for that, we need to have good infrastructure in place, meaning that it has to be convenient to the consumers to bring all the things that they keep in the drawers, as you have clearly identified in your query in the beginning of the meeting, but also to incentivize people to bring back, because one thing is to have something available and accessible. The other thing is, now, why should I bother altogether? So there's got to be some incentive, and we have already some companies who buy back old products, which are at the brink of becoming waste, and we need probably a bit more systemic approach to this. So some kind of either deposit or another solution would be interesting. We're studying this through an idea of establishing some kind of a take-back scheme, maybe across the EU. But for that, we have just launched study. We need to look back into the consumer's behavior and conduct to see what is the trigger that brings them back, that forces them to bring back the products. And then, of course, the third thing is the recycling itself. Again, the products. Electronic products are complex products. They contain lots of super interesting materials, lots of materials of the periodic table. And indeed, we have some excellent companies, some of them are on the panel today, who are excelling in recovering all these materials. Yet a lot of other things, especially the plastics in the electronics, simply get burnt. There is no valorization of that. We extract the most valuable, like platinum or nickel or others, or palladium, but then we'll lose the rest. And part of the problem is the design again, because we simply cannot dismantle very easily, or there is no market for the lower value of these materials. So the recycling has to become a lot more efficient, and then we need to create the markets for the secondary raw materials. And then, of course, the things that I talked about is illegal, all the illegal operations, which need to be stamped out and reined in. Otherwise, we simply would be losing these waste streams to a lot less sustainable and valuable management of all the waste. For that, we need to engage the whole value chain, meaning that all operators, those that produce the electronics, those that sell the electronics, those that treat electronics, and everybody in between, as well as public authorities who are very often responsible for certain infrastructure, as well as organizations like extended producer responsibility organizations, which are absolutely crucial in this chain, all have to play a part here. And for that, we need to align the laws, but we need to align the practices as well. A lot comes down to the member states themselves to take action, but even more so, I would say, on the operators here. And by the way, also standardization, something I haven't mentioned, but another important issue here. And I could go on and on. As I said, there is no simple solution to this, but there is a solution to this.
Well, it's a nice positive way to end. Now, just one last little point before we bring in the rest of our panelists one by one and further our debate as well. You mentioned, obviously, and you focused a little, obviously, due to my initial questioning, about waste leaving the EU. Let's also think about the movement of waste as a last point of reference within the EU. So intra-EU waste shipment as well clearly is something that action can be helpful as part of the solution there. What do you have in mind in terms of also improving the process of intra-EU waste shipment?
Thanks, great question, David. And the answer to that is the revision of the waste shipment regulation, which is really one of the key actions towards circular economy and also helping emerge the market for circular raw materials. Here we aim to adopt the legislative proposal, hopefully in the autumn. It will complement many other actions that we have taken and are planning to adopt in the future. And we are confident that our proposal will facilitate the shipment of waste within the EU in support of recycling industry in Europe, while still maintaining the proper controls to protect the environment. This should help increasing the recycling rates, which is really key for the transformation of the industry, and also in relation to the reduction of the carbon emissions. In the Green Deal and Circular Economy Action Plan, we say a very clear, in which direction we are going. To this end, indeed, it's the facilitation of the shipments of the waste for the reuse. Well, basically, it's the products for the reuse and the waste for recycling in the EU, where we will attempt to simplify, clarify, and modernize the current procedures, reduce delays, avoid the current fragmentation of the single market linked to diverging interpretation of the rules by the member states. And this should help build this dynamic market in the EU and support the uptake of secondary raw materials, which is absolutely key for the transition to circular economy. One key measure here is the shift from paper-based approach to the fully electronic exchange of information and documents. We will also reinforce the use of simplified procedures like fast-track procedure for pre-consented facilities. And the revision will also propose to set up harmonized conditions defining when the recovery facility could be pre-consented by a member state. And there will also be positive changes in extending this consent duration. So all these elements should ensure a smooth and secure path to direct waste towards optimal treatment. And we are aware that such a simplification is a priority for economic operators, all the members of the Eurometro, and we really count on the support in these upcoming discussions in the Parliament and the Council once we have tabled the proposal.
Yeah, noted. And I think thanks for a positive, constructive end there. So thanks very much for expounding those different ideas of how we're going to deal with waste going out of Europe, how we're going to deal with waste within Europe, clearly interconnected as issues to solve, and also how we're going to deal with the intra-waste issue. I'm interested to hear that you've got that priority focus on directing e-waste within Europe and fast tracking that, really facilitating it, moving to the areas already best suited to deal with it to help mitigate the problem. I think that's clearly a development that's very welcomed by many. Right, well, thanks very much for your answers to those questions there, Kęstutis. That's really, I think, a good way to kick us off. I'm now going to bring in Vanessa. And Vanessa, I've got a question for you. Your report, obviously, that's giving us very up-to-date information on this challenge of pollution with e-waste. You highlight the adverse effects of e-waste on human health and the environment strongly in your report. What are your main findings in relation to Europe's goal of moving towards zero pollution for e-waste?
Thank you, David, for the question. And well, I must say that I'm very happy to hear the updates from Kęstutis here, and I can't agree more on all of the points actually that he highlighted. And well, and he also brought in some key elements that I wanted to mention now about indeed where Europe stands with regards to moving towards zero waste. I would say that, of course, as a UNITAR and cycle, as you know, we are United Nations program, so we have a global, let's say, look at the problem, and therefore I must confess that I agree, that I believe actually that e-waste is a global challenge, and that so indeed we need really international collaborations in order to address this very big challenge. However, I believe if we look at the European context, I believe that at the moment, Europe is having one of the most advanced regulations in terms of e-waste. Of course, more needs to be done, and this was already highlighted by Kęstutis. But if we look at Europe in a global international context, I still believe that Europe has a very advanced regulation, and with clear targets of recycling rates and collection rates. And therefore, we're also the continent, according to our statistics, the continent and the region that is collecting most of the highest share of e-waste out of the waste generated. So on average, the European Union is collecting approximately 51% of the waste generated. If we calculate this based on the put on the market indicator, then it's slightly higher. We reach 55% from a more recent study that we conducted. So indeed, still quite far from the target of collecting 85% of the waste generated, but still, I think things are, from our studies, from the global e-waste monitors, we see that the collection rates are increasing year by year. So there are improvements at European level and in some regions of the world. With regards to how Europe can move towards zero waste, I think Cassius really mentioned some key points, and definitely I would say that other than the regulation that currently set the recycling rates, of course, more needs to be done in terms of repairability, reuse, design for disassembly. Those are elements that at the moment are a bit missing from the regulation, not really missing, but maybe, as Cassius said, indeed, the enforcement is a bit lacking. And in terms of exports of e-waste from Europe to the global south or to developing countries, I also agree that more needs to be done in order really to track, check, detect what are the quantities that are going out of Europe and moving towards developing countries, because this is a key, really a key element and aspect that we really need to address at international level. This is why I again state that we should address it at international level, and developing countries should collaborate, in my view, with developed countries and other way around to address this very relevant aspect. At international level, again, there is a basis, that is the Basel Convention. I believe that most of you is aware of. Of course, this is a basis, and but more needs to be done again, because there are several gaps in this regard. In terms of tracking, in terms of documentation, is really how to say, it's very complex to report what is going out, and also the distinction between used and new products, it's very tricky. It's very complicated for governments at the moment to distinguish between what is new and what is used, and the enforcement at the points of entry is lacking in most of the developing countries. This is what we have noticed from most of the process that we are carrying out, really to track the illegal shipment.
If I can come in then, Vanessa, so we've identified the issue there, but taking the solution-based approach today. So you recognize that enforcement, particularly then when it arrives in that third country, then what's your practical suggestion? How are we actually going to address this issue? Because clearly enforcement is a challenging topic, as Kęstutis touched upon. You know, politically a challenging topic to get enforcement right. So what would be your recommendation there in terms of making enforcement work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There could be different things that could be done. Definitely clear collaboration between authorities of the developing countries with authorities of developed countries is key, definitely. They need to talk to each other, and once enforcement is in place and inspections are in place, if the legal tracking is, the legal shipment is detected, then this should be reported to the country that was the place of origin. And then the place of origin, the country, should then investigate internally, where does this flow comes from, and how this can be then further detected and avoided. So I think this is really one practical suggestion. It's very simple in words. In practice, it's more complicated, as you know, to get this done. Another key aspect, I think, is really just improve the inspections at the port, very simply. I understand that it's very complex and very demanding, especially for authorities in developing countries to conduct regular inspections, but still this should become the regular practice, or should become part of the regular practices of detections at the port. And
call me a skeptic here, Vanessa, but I've worked across quite a range of policy areas in my 15 years in Brussels. In my specialist area of communications, working with governments, member states, third countries, institutions, the UN, many other organizations. And when I hear about plans in developing countries to put in place enforcement mechanisms, better infrastructure, the one thing I always do is put myself in the shoes of the recipient country and say, look, based on my experience, and you know what I'm going to say next, but practical in solutions for me, that minister in that country is going to turn to me and say, David, we want to solve this problem together with you. We don't have the resources. You're asking us to hire more staff, improve infrastructure with technology. We don't have the funds and the resources. So practically speaking, how are we going to help countries to better manage the waste flows that we're sending them?
Yeah, you're right. You're completely right here, and this is also part of our regular, let's say, job. And what I can say is that now, for example, I can make an example. We are engaged in a project to detect illegal shipments in Tanzania, and there the UN, so is a consortium of different organizations, is helping, so financing this exercise. And the real aim of this project is to develop guidelines on inspection methods, so then this can be translated into national law or national documents, and then these documents should become the basis for regular inspections in the future. So this should not require additional resources in the future from the country, the recipient country, but should rather be integrated in the regular inspection exercises. And the goal is also to, to export this sort of a model to other countries in the IACO region, so in the Eastern African Community region. So then they can all use similar inspection methods, and also come up with a sort of a basis to collect useful information to combat or to avoid these illegal shipments into that Eastern African region. So that is my proposal, easy proposal, but then as I said, may not be easy at the end of the day, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think as we demonstrated with the poll at the beginning, we've already heard from Kestutis, ambition is needed here, obviously, to solve a complex problem.
Of course.
So I've noted from you then that it's a question here also of making sure that we're effective in the way that we do capacity development with partner countries that are recipients of our e-waste, in such a way that we provide them and we work in partnership with them to ensure that they have the resources they need on their side to deal with this effectively. With that in mind, and thank you for your comments, Vanessa, and your inputs there, I want to move on to Monique. Monique, now I know Fairphone, I was quizzing you about this before we went live. You're going to launch what I see as quite a hard-hitting recycling program. I mean, you make modular phones with replaceable components, with a strong focus on sustainable sourcing of materials. And now you're going to set the trend for the recycling too, from what I hear. What are the drivers in this recycling program of yours? And what are you trying to achieve? What are your aims?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And indeed, so to start again, reiterate what Fairphone does. So we indeed bring to market an ethical and sustainable phone to prove that there is a real demand for such phones and such electronics in general. And what we really focus on is to stretch the lifetime of our phone, of our product, as long as possible, and also ensure that the materials that we use are maintained at its highest value for as long as possible. So that is circularity throughout the whole life cycle. And we are about to launch a very ambitious recycling program, but actually we already are doing a lot on that topic. Before I explain a bit more what we do, let me say first what the key driver is. And I think it has already been mentioned here quite well. It is e-waste being the fastest waste stream worldwide. Our industry pushing billions of products on the market each year, and people being seduced to buy new instead of prolonging the lifetime of its existing devices, or of its the device it has in its hands. So it is there where it starts. And then of those billions of products that are pushed on the market, there's only a limited that is being collected. You already indicated in Europe it's 50%, worldwide it's about 17%, 20%. But also of that material that is being collected, it's not that all that material is actually being reused. Still a lot of that material that is collected is going into the air or in landfills, because there's only a limited amount of minerals and metals that you can extract of that collected waste, so to say. So we really believe that the current collection schemes are failing in that sense, in both not collecting sufficiently, but also in repurposing the waste in the most optimal way to recover the materials at its highest value possible. There's a lot to gain there. And because at the moment, I think that we see that the waste just takes two big jumps down the value chain into flowing into recycling plants, while there's a lot more that can be done with the material that is collected. And we think that one of the problems is that we look at it as, and we call it waste, while it should not be waste. We should redefine e-waste as, I think, e-resources. It's a resource. And from that perspective, we also look at our life cycle and our reverse logistics. And an example is that we started to collect our modules, the modules that are failing with the customer, or modules that are not working anymore. So we offer spare parts. They can be bought on our web shop, and within warranty, we provide them through our customer service. And the old modules we collect and take back. And we started to do this last year, and we never expected that this would become a profitable exercise as soon as it did. Because of those, the modules that we collected, we found that far more than we had anticipated could be quite easily repaired and reused. So that is just a simple, I think, example of how there's so much optimization still possible when looking at it more as a resource rather than waste. Mm-hmm. So let me stop here.
Okay, appreciate your brevity. So it's an interesting concept you bring in there. It shouldn't be we or e-waste, it should be e-resource.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you've touched upon also, just to echo a point we heard earlier, about the central importance of design at the beginning of the chain, as well, of course, as how we collect, how we deal with our resource or e-waste, how we recycle, what happens to exports to other countries, etc. So it's a radical approach you take in one way, Monique, but then I would argue that you're putting it into practice. It was with great interest that I actually looked at your products and I took a component out and put another one in. And then I reflected on how many mobile phones I put for recycling and replaced for the simple reason that one of the components in my phone was no longer functioning. It's an interesting approach of modular design. It's an interesting one. Okay, right. Well, with that in mind, let's move on. Jim, I want to bring you in now. I mean, looking at the idea of extra EU waste shipment, looking on a more global scope of waste going out of Europe, we've heard suggestions, of course, about how we can limit that. I've already seen a few questions from our audience saying, why shouldn't we just ban it instead and properly deal with our own resource at home? But still, this waste, this significant volume of waste that's leaving Europe, or resource that's leaving Europe, to quote Monique, do you think it's recoverable in reality? We've heard plans about dealing with it at the country that it arrives at. Do you think this is feasible? And how do you think we should be dealing with this waste in Europe?
Yeah, well, it's really important to know why waste moves. Why is it going offshore? It's really all about externalizing costs. So you have a product that becomes a liability. It becomes very difficult to manage because of the way it's designed. And therefore, to avoid those costs, you will externalize them to people that will have to pay for them without paying for them economically. So they're going to suffer through their health and damage to their environment. It's an exploitive practice. And I have to say it's antithetical to a circular economy. A lot of people think a circular economy means, oh, we're going to circulate things around the world. No, this is the most linear thing you can do, is exploit people by avoiding costs and not internalizing them, hopefully through designing things properly. That's the best way to internalize costs. I was really happy to hear that all the speakers so far, and particularly the gentleman from the commission, is emphasizing that, because that's what's always left out. It's always most difficult to go up against the big manufacturers and say, I'm sorry, we want your product to last a lot longer. We want it to be repairable. This is a big fight that's happening today. And it's a fight that we have to win, because a lot of the reason this stuff is flowing offshore is because it's so difficult to recycle. It's so toxic, and people don't want to deal with it. It costs money. So you exploit other people who are not going to present you with the bill for that. So the things we can do, very specifically, are all the things we can do that Mr. Kęstutis talked about with green design, but really being tough about it. You know, we think we live in a democracy in Europe and in America, but so many of the things that affect our lives are products, which we don't have a lot of say in how they're designed. There should be a conception of a right to design. The public has a say in the fact that you want a product that lives a long time, that is repairable, that is non-toxic, and you insist upon that. It's vital. So that's the most important thing. Turn off the tap of these really horrific designs that are not upgradable, like the Fairphone, are full of toxicity and full of things that, when they're managed in the developing world, become toxic. We should assume that everything is going to be burned. It's what happens in the developing world. Eventually, after it has a second or third life, it ends up in the dump, and those dumps get burned. So manufacturers have to realize that everything they put in there is going to assume it's going to be burned, and people are going to breathe the emissions. We have to close the loopholes of our waste shipment regulation laws based on the Basel Convention. Now, the EU talks a really good talk about being strict about exports, but they're in the Basel Convention today arguing for a massive loophole that will pull things out from under the controls of the Basel Convention simply because an exporter says it's repairable. And you can make that claim, and outside of the convention you go, and there's no legal recourse at that point. This is a huge fight. The developing countries and our organization is pushing back hard, trying to stop the EU from promoting this. But so far, they have injected this into one of the guidelines. So that's an example of a loophole. They're also pushing for having higher, weaker thresholds of low POPs, of persistent organic pollutants, another loophole. So if we're so insistent about preventing exports, the EU has really got to stop, trying to weaken the laws that do exist. And then finally, we really have to enforce what we have, make it stronger, of course. But what's missing, after I've been observing this for many years, is that if you have a lot of people monitoring the ports and you can actually find violations, that's one thing, but that is not going to serve as a deterrent. I can count on one hand the number of prosecutions that have been successful in Europe for e-waste trade. Very few. And when they are prosecuted, the penalty is a slap on the wrist. If you start throwing people in jail, the message will get there very quickly, and it'll be saved multiple millions of dollars in personnel, just actually, at least for the laws you do have. So I guess I'll leave it there, but I think that's the three prongs. Get green design fully implemented, get an action plan for it, close the loopholes that you're creating, stop creating them, and aggressively and seriously enforce with stiff deterring penalties.
Okay, well, clear manifesto from your side there, Jim, about the actions we need. Thank you. Stephen, I want to bring you in now rapidly before I've got a range of 4 or 5 questions I've been collecting from the audience that I also want to put to all of you before we move towards the end of our discussions today and debate. So Stephen, look, we know, I think many of us are familiar with the idea that Umicore is a big leading e-resource or e-waste recycler in Europe. So from your perspective, what sort of barriers are you experiencing in actually accessing e-resource or e-waste for high quality recycling? And how do you see them as being solvable?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for raising the question, and also thank you for having me. And indeed, before I highlight what we consider as main barriers, also important to understand what Umicore is in the chain of recycling. First of all, we are an end refiner. We're really at the end step of recycling. And we are both recycling from electronic, the precious metals containing fractions, where we take out precious metals and other, but also the batteries. Yeah. And that makes us also very highly involved in what we call the critical raw materials. And we take that from a global customer portfolio. So not only from Europe, but also from outside Europe. And if you look now at what the main barriers are, and I look also to what Jim came to say, because it's very much in line with the point he made, actually, an important barrier is for us the fact that there still is an unlevel playing field in the field of electronics recycling. Yeah? Consumers and organizations who look for a solution for quality recycling, even with good intentions that are looking for a quality solution, they still can be misled by seemingly professional recycling companies that are substandard because they are lacking EHS compliance, they are not having a very good process. And they're also lacking transparency in what happens after they are treating it or reusing it or whatever in the next steps. And the fact indeed that they lack high-end EHS compliance, etc., imposes lower costs. And on top of that, they may also sell the e-waste, what we consider as e-waste, illegally as reusable components. Yeah, which gives, of course, a much higher value, a much higher trade value than the recyclable cost. And this is, of course, an unlevel playing field for the recycling companies that are doing it in a high-end, professional, efficient, and transparent way. That's, I think, one of the main barriers. How can we sort this? I've heard a lot of good things in the answers, among other from Jim, but also from Kestutis. To our opinion, there should be more ambitious norms on the traceability of the full recycling flow. So not only the tier 1 reporting, but also the next step, and this until and including the final recycling step when the e-waste becomes new raw materials. That should be fully monitored and fully reported. I've seen some good initiatives there also in the Zero Waste Action Plan and in the Green Deal, etc. That's great. So that's, I think, a very important way forward. And I also wonder how Jim and Ben is looking at this to make it the full recycling flow traceable. A second thing, if you want to have a good traceability and if you want to be sure that your material goes to right quality recycling, you need to refer also to a standard. I mentioned substandard. If you say substandard, then what's the standard? There are very good standards in place at this point in time. In Europe, outside Europe, more standards are to become. They should be made mandatory for all companies that want to be active in the electronics recycling. Yeah. Electronics recycling, because to my opinion, it's not a commodity business. It's not subject to free trade. It should be clearly made compliant. And adjacent to that, adjacent to recycling, you also have, of course, reuse. And also Jim highlighted it. Reuse, it's a great thing. Also, recycling company like ours fosters, of course, the added value of reuse, also in terms of CO2, etc. But it should be done by approved, proper reuse and repair companies. And I'm afraid that in that landscape of reuse companies, you still have too many companies that are systematically or opportunistically doing a false reuse, among other coming from e-waste fractions that are illegally or intransparently, let me put it this way, sold to recycling companies for recycling purposes, but that then are partially reused.
Okay, so from your view then, we really need much more stringent and equal level playing field standards for everybody here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, now I've got an interesting question that's coming from our audience. I've been holding for a little while here. And thanks for our patient audience in waiting for those. And someone's brought up a very interesting point for me. We're talking here about the idea, almost taking it for granted, that we're going to keep exporting vast amounts of waste to other countries. And someone's brought up an interesting concept about enforcement for me here. And I quote the question, it's from Patrick van der Bosch. Should the inspections not be at the point of departure? In the sense that rather than shipping waste to developing countries, and asking them to deal with the issue, shouldn't we be better checking what's leaving our own borders? I don't know what each of you, our speakers, think about this. Jim, do you want to come in on this one? Should enforcement best be at destination point or departure point?
Well, that's exactly how the Basel Convention is designed to work. It puts the onus on the exporting country that is a party to take the first responsibility. And their first responsibility is to make sure that it's going to go to an ESM facility, that it's all notified properly, that it's been consented to. So they do have the primary responsibility. The other states, of course, are involved, transit states and importing states, but really it's meant to be the exporting state. Where it gets really messy is when we start putting all these loopholes in, and the people at customs level or at the environment agency level at the border looking at the container and it's full of a bunch of used electronics, they have a very difficult time because the rules are so convoluted, and now we're pushing for repairability loopholes. And some exporter can say, don't worry, it's going to be repaired. And sometimes that's going to be a total sham. It's not going to be repaired. Sometimes the market changes and they can't afford to repair it. Sometimes when you repair, you create hazardous waste. So it should be a transboundary movement. It should be under the control of the Basel Convention. And if we are going to allow it, there has to be full transparency, which the Basel Convention required. What the EU has been pushing really hard at the Basel Convention is to totally, when something is repairable or claimed to be repairable, then the Basel Convention does not consider it a waste. And we find that extremely dangerous.
Okay, noted. So you have an issue with that. You would then be in favor perhaps of stronger checks at the point of departure and not putting the full weight onto the point of arrival, or a larger weight. Vanessa, I see you indicating a little on this one as well. I'd love to hear your view on this too.
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree, actually. Also on our side, we totally agree that the responsibilities should definitely be from the country that is exporting. But here again, there is another gap, another problem, because sometimes the country that is exporting is actually not the origin of the waste, because maybe the waste is shipped from another country even. So this traceability is really hard to be implemented at the end of the day. And in our projects in developing countries, it's something that we always say, it's not your responsibility, it's just, of course, is the responsibility of the ones who are shipping the e-waste, but then we also encourage them to collaborate, to detect, so then the organizations, authorities can talk to each other and hopefully solve the problem together.
Kestutis, are you still with us? I want to bring you in on this as well.
Yes, I'm with you.
Wonderful. So I just want to bring in your view on this. I've heard from the question and from Jim and Vanessa, you know, the concept here is about also having much more stringent checks in place for what's leaving Europe's borders. I mean, Vanessa's obviously made the key point. The point of destination may not be where the waste has originated from, but since Europe is an entity in itself, do we have a European responsibility then to have much better enforcement, not just at the point of arrival of the e-waste in a third country, but also at the point of departure on our side as well?
Yes, I do agree. In fact, it's not only the responsibility, but also it's the effectiveness, or let's say cost effectiveness of that approach. Because once it's left, you know, how much control do you have? And that's precisely one of the things that we'd like to tighten up in the waste shipment regulation, which is our tool to transpose the Basel Convention. And in fact, I also agree that for the customs, it's pretty difficult to check all this. Not only because customs is normally used to checking the imports, that's their origin, you know, because they are meant here to check the imports, to collect the customs duties, to check the safety, to look at the rules of origin, etc. The export, the outbound flow of the goods and of the waste, or whatever the thing could be, is really, you know, something in addition. And even though around the EU we have 130,000 customs officers altogether, when you count all the possible exit points of the EU, and the EU is, you know, is a continent, is a vast continent with a long shores, and many ports, the effectiveness of that control is really low. And in fact, we do have issues where you have basically a handful of custom officers who operate on huge ports, So clearly here is an issue. Now, but the other thing is, that's precisely why I said we would like to make sure that if the waste is sent to third countries for the treatment, that there's got to be a very good and proved assurance that it's going to the right place, because right now we cannot control it, So unless you get that assurance, you cannot export, and that assurance needs to be pretty well done and tightened up, not like right now it is. So the burden of proof has to be on the exporter. So that's the idea. At the same time, as I said, we don't want to ban outright everything, because
there are some. Hold you there half a second.
Yeah.
We've had a number of questions from our audience on this topic as well. Yeah. I want to place that to you and then open it to the others as well before we wrap up. Look, we all know that Europe's got a high dependency on imports of primary raw materials. Mm-hmm. We all know that a lot of the materials we're talking about here, from e-resource, from e-waste, are critical raw materials. So did you not consider the idea in your whole planning towards this of just banning exports and saying, look, this is our waste, we need to deal with it in-house? I've got a lot of audience members saying, why with our critical raw material shortages? Mm-hmm. Why with the fact we need 300-400% to meet our Green Deal commitments by 2050 for some of these critical non-ferrous metals, for example? Why are we not just saying, right, close the doors and deal with our own problem in-house? Or is that too simplistic?
That's too simplistic. In principle, that's right, but that's too simplistic. I agree with you. Now, again, it's right, because indeed, a lot of that waste, electronic waste, but also others, they do contain valuable resources. And that has already been said here, and all the more so when you talk about rare earths and critical raw materials. And we've issued a number of reports precisely saying that, is that if we recycle our own waste, we do increase a lot of supply and that. And in fact, this is precisely what we have done in our proposal for the batteries, and we're going after, other pieces of legislation. At the same time, you need to be mindful is that, we are talking here the borderline about either it's the shipment of waste, and there is a never-ending story of what is waste, what is not, because for some it's waste, for others it's second-hand good, and this is what has been abused. But we're talking here about the trade in commodities, and trade in commodities is regulated by global trade rules. So there, if you want to regulate either export or import or anything, you need to be sure that you are fully compliant with this. And in fact, in some cases, we have interest. For example, steel. We don't want to export steel because we want to have it, ourselves. But global trade is pretty fluid there as well. But you have completely different picture when you have plastics or paper, for example. Is it different market dynamics, different price dynamics, and different drivers behind all of this. So you need to really look into all of that. Let alone the fact that there are some established and pretty well controlled routes and trades also in waste, which are quite efficient there, and I would say reasonably safe. But that, I would say, again, should be seen as an exception, not as a rule. So yes, we cannot base ourselves simply off the fact that we want to be independent from the critical raw materials, because we'll always have to import them. But by stopping exporting of that, we will reduce that dependence. Yet, if we stop the whole thing, we need to be mindful that it might backfire, both through our reputation on global trade rules, as well as from the countries who export. So it's a bit of a balancing that we'll need to do. And the only way, and the only legal excuse that we can have, according to the global trade rules, is the environmental ones. You cannot invoke strategic dependence. You cannot do this legally. But environmental, yes, you can.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. I'm keeping an eye on the clock here and also our audience and their schedules too. So I'm going to ask you now just to bring things to a little bit of a conclusion, everybody. So I'm going to start off, Vanessa, with you, then Monique. I'm going to start off, Kestutis, with you, then Vanessa, then Monique, then Jim, and then Stephen. And I call on you now just to wrap things up a little bit with just a little closing comment. And when I say closing comment, I mean a brief closing comment just to respect our time and our audience. So Kęstutis, if you had to leave us with one final statement in relation to the purpose of our debate today, solving this e-waste pollution challenge. Yep, complex problem, requires complex solutions with all stakeholders involved. But if there's one big element that you want to leave us with, what would it be?
Yes. Well, it's basically the GFK statement, because, you need to ask what you can do here. And I'm saying this because it is a complex issue and everybody has to play the part. You cannot push it on the others. You cannot say, well, I would do the great thing if only someone else would also do the same thing, whether it's producers, retailers, consumers, European Union, Commission, member states, etc. No, everybody has to play part. If one part of this chain doesn't function, the chain doesn't function.
Okay, so integrated solution with everybody involved. Thank you. Vanessa, what about you?
Yeah, I would share the same view in the context of an international context. I would say it is necessary to strengthen the collaboration between countries, especially global North with global South, while at the same time every single country should address their own problem, but also at the international level we need to collaborate with each other to address the global e-waste challenge, since it has an international nature.
Okay, so global problems require proper integrated and global solution.
Yes.
Okay, Monique, from your side?
Yes, from my side, it's really about redefining e-waste and look at it not as waste, but as a resource. So we should apply resource management and not waste management to what we collect from the customers. And for the EU, I think that there's also a big step to take in facilitating the infrastructure that is needed to make the reverse logistics happen and to take away the barrier of high transport costs to optimize materials throughout all those different cycles in the larger circular life cycle.
Okay, well noted. So radical change of approach required in the same radical way that your phones are repairable. Definitely. Very consistent on your side, I must say. All right, moving on then, Jim, what have you got as a closing thought for us?
Sure, two thoughts. One on the debate on transboundary movement. With electronic waste, it should be very clear. If something is hazardous and it's non-functional, it should be banned from export to non-OECD countries. That is extremely clear, and the EU would do well to not fudge that. On the bigger issue of design, it's all important. We have got to design our products to have a long life, to be repairable, to be toxic free, to be collectible. All of this has to happen at the design stage. Everything else is extremely inefficient. So all we can do to turn off the tap at the front end of the life cycle, that's what we've got to work on.
Okay, so a much stronger focus from your side then. So respect the Basel Convention and a stronger focus, not just at the recycling end, but at the design end as well. Okay, and last but not least, Stephen.
Far more.
Yes, Dink. I want to make 2 points here out of the discussion. First of all, the export of e-waste, when it's clear when we're talking about waste, I don't believe in granting any possibility to export that waste to developing countries. There should, at this point in time, until further notice, be a ban of exporting waste to developing countries, for the simple reason that there's enough own domestic waste that they have to deal with properly themselves, and we have to organize that first. A lot of things to be talked about that. That's a first point. Second point, I heard a lot about channeling e-waste for recycling or reuse into the right channels and integrated solutions. For me, this all comes back to what I said at the beginning, standards. There have been good attempts in making standards. Continuous work is ongoing. I think about the sea waste standard. I think also about ongoing regulations. The draft battery regulation also set clear targets for CRMs. That work should continue. Further work on making right standards also for reuse, for reuse organizations outside the EU to make their clear agreement on what a decent and good reuse company is, and make them mandatory.
Okay, so stop the e-waste exports in the way you've mentioned, and better, more stringent and fully mandatory standards for everyone. Okay, thanks very much, Steve.
Stop e-waste export to developing countries.
To developing countries. Noted, noted. Thanks for the clarification. Right, so with those closing comments then, I think in an hour, we've made a lot of ground on what we all know is a very complex and multifaceted problem, but it's good to hear so many constructive solutions being put forward, and a number of challenges as well, about being consistent, obviously, on an international level with standards. With that in mind, I'll bring things to a conclusion now. A warm virtual round of applause to our speakers. Of course, Kęstutis, Vanessa, Stephen, Monique, and Jim. A big thank you to our audience for your time and attention and questions. And I wish you all a very productive end to your week. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye for